The early morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Street as John Harrison carefully made his way down the familiar sidewalk. At 93, his steps weren't as quick as they used to be, but his daily routine remained unchanged. The veteran's weathered face, marked with deep lines that told stories of both joy and hardship, brightened as he approached Mary's Diner, his favorite breakfast spot for the past 23 years. Inside the diner, the familiar bell chimed as John pushed open the heavy glass door. The aroma of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, making him smile. Sarah, the longtime waitress who had served him since she was just a teenager, waved from behind the counter. "Your usual spot's waiting for you, Mr. Harrison," she called out cheerfully. John made his way to his corner booth, the worn red vinyl seat practically molded to his shape after all these years. His gnarled fingers, still strong despite their arthritis, wrapped around the warm coffee cup Sarah brought without him having to ask. This was his sanctuary, a place where memories of the war seemed distant, replaced by the comfortable rhythms of small-town life. What made John different from other regulars wasn't just his age or his veteran status. It was the way he connected with everyone around him, especially the children who often stopped by the diner with their parents. They were drawn to him like moths to a flame, fascinated by the small military pin he always wore on his navy blue cardigan. "Mr. Harrison, tell us another story," they would beg, and John's pale blue eyes would twinkle as he shared carefully chosen tales from his military days, always making sure to keep the horrors of war far from their innocent minds. Instead, he told them about friendship, bravery, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Back at home, John's modest two-bedroom house stood out in the neighborhood, not for its size but for its immaculate garden. Every afternoon, weather permitting, he could be found tending to his flowers and vegetables. His prized roses, planted in neat rows along the white picket fence, were the envy of the neighborhood garden club. Mrs. Chen, his next-door neighbor for the past 15 years, often brought him homemade dumplings in exchange for gardening advice. "Your green thumb is magic, Mr. Harrison," she would say, watching him carefully prune his tomato plants. John would just smile, remembering how he learned gardening from his mother before the war, a skill that had given him peace during the difficult years that followed his return home. Inside his house, photographs lined the walls, snapshots of a life well lived. There he was in his marine dress blues, standing proud and tall in 1943. Another showed him with his late wife, Margaret, on their wedding day in 1947. Children's artwork decorated his refrigerator, gifts from the neighborhood kids who saw him as an honorary grandfather. Every evening, John would sit in his worn leather armchair by the window, a gift from Margaret before she passed away 5 years ago. He would watch the sunset while writing in his journal, documenting his thoughts and memories for future generations. Sometimes, he would pause to look at Margaret's photo on the side table, touching it gently with fingers that had once held rifles but now preferred to hold garden tools. The neighborhood children knew that if they saw his porch light on after dinner, they were welcome to stop by for one of the butterscotch candies he always kept in a crystal bowl by the door. Parents trusted him implicitly, knowing that their children would return home not just with candy, but with valuable lessons about respect, honor, and kindness. Life had fallen into a comfortable pattern for John. His military pension, combined with careful saving over the years, allowed him to live modestly but comfortably. He didn't need much. His garden, his morning visits to the diner, and the company of his neighbors were enough to keep him content. Little did John know that his peaceful routine was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't imagine. The familiar sounds of birds chirping and children playing would soon be drowned out by the roar of motorcycle engines, and his quiet corner of the world would become the center of an unexpected conflict. But for now, as he sat in his favorite booth at Mary's Diner, sipping his coffee and greeting the morning regulars, everything was just as it should be. It started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. John Harrison was walking toward Mary's Diner when he first heard the rumble. The sound grew louder, echoing off the buildings along Main Street, until a group of 15 motorcycles roared into the diner's parking lot. Their chrome pipes gleamed in the morning sun, and their black leather-clad riders dismounted with practiced ease. The peaceful atmosphere that John had grown accustomed to over the years shattered as the bikers' loud laughter and revving engines filled the air. Sarah, the waitress, watched nervously through the diner's large front window as the group made their way toward the entrance. The bell above the door chimed repeatedly as they filed in, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. John sat in his usual corner booth, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. He watched as the bikers commandeered the largest table in the center of the diner, pushing several tables together without asking permission. Their leather vests displayed patches identifying them as members of the Road Warriors MC, with their leader, a tall man with a thick gray beard, wearing a patch that read President. The usual morning customers seemed to shrink in their seats, conversations dropping to whispers. Even little Tommy Miller, who usually ran to John's table to share his latest school achievements, clung to his mother's side as they hurriedly finished their breakfast. The diner's warm, welcoming atmosphere had transformed in mere minutes. Mary, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen with a worried expression. She was a strong woman who had run this place single-handedly since her husband passed away, but even she seemed uncertain about how to handle this new situation. The bikers were loud, but not openly disruptive, ordering breakfast and coffee like any other customers. As days passed, the motorcycle club made the diner their regular morning meeting spot. They arrived each day between 7 and 8, just when John usually enjoyed his peaceful breakfast. The parking lot, once a quiet space where elderly regulars could easily park their cars, now filled with rows of gleaming motorcycles. The regular customers began changing their schedules. Mrs. Peterson, who had shared morning coffee with John for over a decade, started coming an hour earlier. Mr. Rodriguez, the retired mailman, switched to getting his breakfast to go. Only John maintained his routine, refusing to let the unwelcome change alter his daily habits. One morning, as John walked past the bikers' motorcycles, he noticed something that caught his attention. Several of the bikes had military service stickers, Army, Marines, Air Force, but these were partially covered by newer stickers with aggressive slogans. It reminded him of some of the troubled veterans he'd known after the war, men who struggled to find their place in peaceful society. The diner's staff adapted to their new customers. There was an underlying tension. Sarah's usual cheerful banter became more reserved, and Mary spent more time in the kitchen than greeting customers. The morning regulars who still came spoke in hushed tones about calling the police, but the bikers hadn't actually broken any laws. John observed it all quietly from his corner booth, taking mental notes like he used to do during his reconnaissance missions in the Pacific. He noticed how the bikers' leader would occasionally glance his way with what seemed like irritation, perhaps bothered by the presence of this elderly man who refused to be intimidated. The situation reached a new level when the bikers began parking their motorcycles closer to the diner's entrance, creating a narrow path that was difficult for older customers to navigate. John, with his cane and slow gait, found himself having to carefully maneuver between the bikes each morning. Some of the neighborhood children who used to visit him at the diner stopped coming altogether, their parents concerned about the new crowd. The once lively morning conversations were replaced by the constant rumble of motorcycle engines and boisterous laughter from the bikers' table. As April turned to May, John could feel the tension building. The peaceful breakfast spot that had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades was becoming a place of stress and discomfort. But something in his military training and life experience told him that this situation would eventually come to a head. He just didn't know how soon that confrontation would arrive, or how it would test his courage once again. The situation at Mary's diner grew more tense with each passing day. John Harrison noticed how the bikers' behavior became increasingly bold, especially when they realized he wouldn't change his routine. They seemed to take his stubborn presence as a personal challenge, and their subtle harassment began to escalate. One particularly warm morning, as John made his careful way through the maze of parked motorcycles, the biker's leader, who the others called Bear, deliberately started his engine. The sudden roar made John's hands shake, causing him to stumble slightly. The group erupted in laughter, their mocking voices carrying across the parking lot. "Having trouble there, old-timer?" One of them called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe it's time to stay home and watch your soap operas instead." Sarah, watching from inside the diner, started toward the door to help, but John waved her off. He straightened his back, adjusted his grip on his cane, and continued his walk to the entrance with as much dignity as he could muster. His face remained calm, but those who knew him well could see the tightness around his eyes. Inside the diner, the harassment continued in subtle ways. The bikers would raise their voices when discussing their rides and adventures, throwing obvious glances at John to see if he was intimidated. They began taking up more space, spreading their jackets and helmets across empty booths, making it difficult for other customers to find seats. Mary tried to maintain order in her establishment, but she was fighting a losing battle. When she politely asked them to keep their voices down one morning, Bear stood up to his full height, towering over her. "We're paying customers," he said, his voice quiet but threatening. "And last I checked, there's no law against enjoying breakfast with my brothers." John watched these interactions from his corner booth, his coffee growing cold as he observed the changing dynamics. He noticed how young Tommy Miller, who used to come in with his mother every Thursday morning, now pressed his face against the diner's window from outside, too scared to enter when the bikers were there. The breaking point came when the bikers started making comments about John's appearance. They mocked his carefully pressed shirts and his polished shoes, relics of a military discipline he'd never abandoned. They laughed at how he arranged his silverware with precision, another habit from his service days. "Look at him, thinking he's still in some fancy officer's mess," one biker sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. Bet he never saw a day of real action in his life. What they didn't know was that every morning, before coming to the diner, John polished his shoes while looking at the faded photograph of his old Marine unit. Many of those young faces had never made it home from the Pacific. The pressed shirts and polished shoes weren't about vanity, they were about honoring their memory. The regular customers who still braved the diner's new atmosphere watched with growing concern. They'd known John for years, had heard snippets of his war stories, and understood there was much more to the quiet old man than the bikers realized. Mrs. Chen, who still came for her morning tea, would sometimes reach over and pat John's hand supportively. One morning, as John worked his way through his usual breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs, he overheard the bikers planning to bring even more of their group to the diner. They talked about making it their official meeting spot, laughing about how they were cleaning up the place by driving away the old fogies. Sarah, bringing John his coffee refill, had tears in her eyes. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, "maybe you should find another place for breakfast. Just until they move on. I'm worried about you." John looked up at her, his blue eyes clear and steady. In that moment, he remembered the faces of his fellow Marines, young men who had stood their ground on distant beaches against impossible odds. He remembered the lessons he'd learned about courage, about standing up to bullies, about the importance of defending what's right. The time for quiet observation was coming to an end. John knew he would have to take action soon, but he also knew that timing was everything. Just as in war, he would need to choose his moment carefully. As he finished his breakfast that morning, he began formulating a plan, one that would draw upon experiences these bikers couldn't begin to imagine. The morning that changed everything started like any other. John Harrison walked toward Mary's diner just as the sun began to warm the spring air, but today was different. He had made a decision. After weeks of enduring the bikers' increasingly aggressive behavior, he knew it was time to take a stand. As he approached the diner, he saw that the motorcycle club had outdone themselves. Over 20 bikes now crowded the parking lot, leaving barely any space for other customers. The noise was deafening as riders continued to arrive, their engines deliberately revving louder whenever an elderly patron tried to enter or leave the restaurant. Inside, the situation was even worse. The bikers had pushed together nearly half the diner's tables, creating what they called their territory. Mary stood behind the counter, her face strong with worry, as she watched her once peaceful establishment descend into chaos. Sarah barely managed to squeeze between the crowded tables as she tried to serve other customers. John made his way to his usual corner booth, only to find 3 bikers lounging in it. His seat, the one he'd occupied every morning for over 2 decades, was now covered with their leather jackets and helmets. Bear, the group's leader, watched with a smirk as John stood there, leaning on his cane. "Looking for something, old-timer?" Bear called out, causing several of his companions to snicker. "Seems like all the good seats are taken. Maybe it's a sign you should find somewhere else for your morning coffee." The diner fell silent. Even the bikers stopped their loud conversations to watch. Mrs. Peterson, sitting nearby, clutched her purse tightly, while Mr. Rodriguez stood up halfway from his seat, unsure whether to intervene. John took a deep breath, remembering similar moments of tension from long ago. Moments when everything hung in the balance, when standing down meant losing something precious. He straightened his back, ignoring the familiar ache from an old war wound, and took a step toward Bear's table. "Young man," John said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority that had once commanded men in battle, "I'd like to have a word with you about respect." Bear stood up slowly, his impressive height meant to intimidate. The leather of his vest creaked as he crossed his arms, a theatrical display of strength that had probably worked countless times before. Respect? He growled. You want to teach us about respect? The other bikers formed a loose circle around John, their boots scuffing against the linoleum floor as they moved. Some wore amused expressions, while others showed hints of anticipation for what they assumed would be entertaining confrontation with a helpless old man. Mary emerged from behind the counter, dish towel twisted in her hands. Now, Bear, there's no need for. It's all right, Mary. John interrupted gently, never taking his eyes off Bear. These young men, and I need to have this conversation. Sarah had her phone out, ready to call the police, but John gave her a slight shake of his head. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about something more fundamental, about standing up to bullies, about protecting a place that meant something to the community. You've been trying to push me out of this diner for weeks, John continued, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. You've mocked my age, my habits, the way I dress. You've harassed other customers, disrespected the staff, and turned a peaceful gathering place into somewhere people are afraid to visit. Bear took a step closer, using his size to loom over John. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it, Gramps? The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching the small military pin on John's cardigan. It glinted briefly, drawing Bear's eye. For a moment, something flickered across the biker leader's face, a hint of recognition, perhaps, or uncertainty. John squared his shoulders, feeling the weight of years fall away. In that moment, he wasn't just a 93-year-old veteran having breakfast. He was every person who had ever faced down a bully, every soldier who had stood their ground against impossible odds. I'm going to tell you a story, John said, his voice taking on a tone that made several of the bikers exchange glances. One that I think you need to hear. And then, young man, you're going to make a choice about the kind of person you really want to be. The tension in Mary's diner felt like a tightly wound spring as John Harrison stood before the circle of bikers. Without waiting for an invitation, he pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat down, placing his cane carefully beside him. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he were about to share a casual story rather than face down a group of intimidating bikers. Let me tell you about a morning much like this one. John began, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent diner. Except it wasn't in this diner, it was on a beach called Iwo Jima, February 1945. Bear's expression shifted slightly at the mention of the famous battle. Some of the older bikers straightened up, their faces showing the first hints of genuine interest. John noticed these subtle changes, but continued as if he were simply sharing a morning conversation. I was a Marine Corps sergeant then, leading a platoon of men barely old enough to shave. We faced something far more threatening than a group of bikers that morning. We faced enemy bunkers, artillery, and the knowledge that many of us wouldn't see the sunset. John reached into his wallet and carefully withdrew a worn black and white photograph. The edges were frayed, but the image was clear, a group of young Marines, dirty and exhausted, standing on volcanic sand. In the center stood a younger version of John, his face streaked with grime but his eyes carrying the same steady gaze he had now. 3 of the men in this photo died saving others that day, John continued, his voice growing softer. They didn't care about looking tough or intimidating anyone. They cared about protecting their brothers, about doing what was right. The photograph passed from hand to hand among the bikers. Even Beer leaned in to look, his previous sneer replaced by an expression of grudging respect. John noticed how some of the bikers touched their own veteran pins unconsciously as they studied the image. After Iwo Jima, they sent us to Okinawa, John went on. That's where I earned these. He pulled up his pant leg slightly, revealing scars that spoke of old wounds. Pulled 4 wounded Marines to safety under heavy fire. They gave me the Silver Star for that, but the real reward was knowing those men got to go home to their families. Sarah, who had worked at the diner for years, stood with her hand over her mouth. In all the time she'd known John, he'd never shared these details of his service. Other regular customers looked on with newfound understanding of the quiet veteran they'd seen every morning. But that's not all, John continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small blue box and opened it, revealing a Navy Cross, one of the highest military decorations possible. The metal gleamed in the morning light streaming through the diner's windows. They gave me this for what happened next, said Okinawa. Our company was pinned down, taking heavy casualties. Someone had to do something impossible to save the rest. Sometimes, one person has to stand up, even when everyone else thinks they're too old, too weak, or too afraid. The diner remained absolutely silent as John described the events of that day, how he had single-handedly taken out 3 enemy positions, saving his entire company. His words painted a picture not of glory or bravado, but of duty, sacrifice, and the brutal cost of war. "I didn't tell you this story to brag," John said, carefully returning the medal to his pocket. "I told you because every morning I come to this diner and remember those men, not just the ones who died, but the ones who lived and had to find their way in the world afterward. Some of them struggled, like I suspect some of you have struggled." Bear shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand unconsciously touching a Vietnam service pin partially hidden under his vest's collar. Other bikers exchanged glances, their earlier bravado replaced by something more complex, recognition, perhaps, or shame. "So when you see an old man walking slowly, using a cane, wearing pressed shirts and polished shoes," John concluded, his voice firm but gentle, "remember that you don't know his story. You don't know what battles he's fought, what courage lies beneath the surface, or what respect he's earned." The truth of who John Harrison really was hung in the air like a challenge, but also like an invitation to remember what real strength, real courage, and real respect truly meant. As the weight of John's words settled over the diner, Bear took a step back and slowly removed his leather vest. There, pinned to his shirt underneath, was a collection of military medals, remnants of his own service in Vietnam. His hands trembled slightly as he held the vest, a vulnerability showing through his tough exterior for the first time. "Sergeant Harrison," Bear said, his voice different now, stripped of its previous mockery, "I served with the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, 1968. He paused, swallowing hard. "But we never faced anything like Iwo Jima or Okinawa." John stood up carefully, reaching for his cane. In that moment, he wasn't just an elderly veteran. He was every inch the Marine sergeant who had led men into battle. His voice carried the same command presence that had once guided troops through the Pacific theater. "Everything I learned about courage, honor, and respect," John declared, looking around the circle of bikers, "I learned not just in battle, but in the quiet moments between. It's not about how many enemies you face, it's about how you carry yourself every single day." He took a step toward Bear, his cane tapping softly against the linoleum floor. "When I see you and your men intimidating elderly customers, harassing waitresses, and disrespecting this establishment, I don't see warriors. I see men who have forgotten the true meaning of strength." Several of the bikers lowered their heads, unable to meet John's steady gaze. One by one, others began revealing their own service pins and medals, previously hidden beneath leather and bravado. The diner had become a gathering of veterans spanning different generations and conflicts. "I come here every morning," John continued, his voice growing stronger, "not just for breakfast, but to honor the memory of those who never made it home. Every pressed shirt, every polished shoe, every yes ma'am and thank you sir. These aren't just habits, they're my way of showing respect for their sacrifice." Mary wiped tears from her eyes behind the counter, while Sarah stood motionless, coffee pot forgotten in her hand. The regular customers watched in amazement as the scene unfolded, witnessing the transformation taking place before them. "So here's my declaration," John announced, standing as tall as his 93 years would allow. "This diner will remain what it has always been, a place of respect, community, and peace. If you want to be part of that, you're welcome to stay. But if you're here to intimidate and disrespect, then you're dishonoring not just this place, but the uniform you once wore." The silence that followed was profound. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed muted, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Bear looked at his vest, then at his fellow riders, before turning back to John. "I lost my way after Vietnam," Bear admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "We all did, in some way. Found it easier to be feared than to deal with the memories." He gestured to his motorcycle club. "Built this family because we didn't know how to fit in anywhere else." John's expression softened slightly. "I understand that better than you might think. After the war, I struggled too. But it was places like this diner, people like Mary and Sarah, that helped me remember who I was meant to be." The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene. John stood in its light, his military pin gleaming, as he made his final declaration. "So what's it going to be, gentlemen? Are you going to be the men you once were, men of honor, men who protected others? Or are you going to continue down this path, becoming exactly what we all once fought against?" The question hung in the air, challenging each person present to examine their own choices and actions. The transformation that had begun with John's story now waited for its conclusion, as Bear and his riders faced a decision that would define not just their future at the diner, but their path forward as veterans and as men. In that moment, the distinction between old and young, between veteran and biker, seemed to fade away. They were all warriors who had lost their way, and now, thanks to one brave old Marine's declaration, they had a chance to find it again. Bear stood silently for a long moment, his weathered face showing a complex mix of emotions. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed his service pins from his vest and began attaching them properly to his shirt, where they belonged. The gesture was small but significant, a return to military pride and protocol that he had long ago abandoned. "Sergeant Harrison," Bear said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there before, requesting permission to pull up a chair and hear more about Iwo Jima, sir. The words came naturally, as if decades of practiced toughness were falling away to reveal the soldier underneath. John's face softened into a gentle smile. "Permission granted, soldier. And bring your men with you, those who want to listen." What happened next transformed the atmosphere of Mary's diner completely. The bikers rearranged the tables, not in a show of dominance this time, but to create a space where everyone could sit together. Several removed their heavy leather jackets, revealing more service pins and military tattoos that told their own stories of sacrifice and duty. Mary, sensing the change in the air, brought fresh coffee for everyone. Sarah started serving breakfast with a smile that hadn't been seen in weeks. The regular customers, who had been watching from the edges of the diner, began to relax and lean in to listen. "Tell us about your unit, Sergeant," one of the younger bikers asked, his own army tattoo visible on his forearm. "What was it like, fighting in the Pacific?" John began sharing stories he had never told at the diner before. He spoke of courage and fear, of brotherhood and loss, of moments that tested not just strength but character. As he talked, the bikers shared their own experiences. Bear's time in Vietnam, others' service in Desert Storm, and some of the youngest members' tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. The morning stretched on, and for the first time in weeks, no motorcycles roared in the parking lot. The only sounds were of quiet conversation, occasional laughter, and the clink of coffee cups. Tommy Miller and his mother, who had been watching through the window, cautiously came inside. To everyone's surprise, Bear pulled out a chair for them, even offering Tommy a gentle fist bump. "You know what the hardest part was?" Bear confessed, looking into his coffee cup. "Coming home. Trying to fit in when everything felt wrong. The bikes, the club. It was the only place we felt like we belonged." Other bikers nodded in agreement. John listened, understanding in his eyes. "We all faced that struggle," he said. "Some of us were lucky enough to find places like this diner, people who helped us remember who we were beneath the scars." As the morning wore on, a remarkable transformation took place. The bikers began sharing their own stories of service, not with bravado but with honesty. They spoke of nightmares that still haunted them, of struggles to adapt to civilian life, of the brotherhood they'd found in their motorcycle club. Mrs. Peterson, who had been afraid to come to the diner for weeks, found herself sharing stories about her late husband, who had served in Korea. Mr. Rodriguez talked about his son currently serving overseas. The diner had become what it was always meant to be, a place where community came together, where stories were shared, and where respect breached all gaps. Bear stood up at one point, addressing his fellow riders. "Brothers, we lost our way. We forgot what it meant to serve, to protect. But thanks to Sergeant Harrison, we have a chance to make it right." The other bikers nodded solemnly. One by one, they began cleaning up their mess from breakfast, properly arranging the tables and chairs, and treating the space with the respect it deserved. Some even offered apologies to Mary and Sarah for their previous behavior. As the morning crowd began to thin, Bear approached John one last time. "Sergeant Harrison," he said, standing at attention, "would you consider sharing breakfast with us again tomorrow? We could all learn a lot from your experience." John looked around the diner, at Mary's relieved smile, at Sarah's brightened face, at the regular customers now mingling comfortably with the bikers. The transformation wasn't just in the atmosphere, it was in the hearts of everyone present. Tomorrow and every morning after, John replied, as long as you remember what we learned here today. The old Marine had done more than stand up to bullies, it helped lost warriors find their way home. 1 year later, Mary's diner looked very different from that transformative morning. The parking lot now displayed an organized arrangement of motorcycles alongside regular cars, with special spaces marked and reserved for elderly customers. A new sign hung proudly near the entrance. Veterans welcome, all services, all generations. John Harrison still arrived each morning at his usual time, but now he rarely sat alone. The corner booth had been officially designated as the Veterans Corner, with a small plaque bearing the names of local servicemen and women who had passed away. Bear and his riders made sure the booth was always available for John, treating it with the same respect they would give a military memorial. The motorcycle club had undergone its own transformation. Under Bear's leadership, they had renamed themselves the Veterans Guard Riders, and their leather vests now carried patches of service pride alongside their club insignia. Their mission had shifted from intimidation to protection and community service. Every Thursday morning, like clockwork, they escorted elderly veterans to and from the diner, providing rides for those who could no longer drive. Young Tommy Miller, once afraid of the bikers, now sat wide-eyed as both John and Bear shared carefully chosen stories about service, honor, and the importance of protecting others. Uncle Bear, as Tommy had started calling him, had even begun teaching the boy basic motorcycle maintenance in the parking lot after breakfast, while John watched from his usual spot, smiling at the unlikely friendship that had formed. Sarah had noticed other changes too. The bikers who once made her job difficult now treated her with military courtesy, addressing her as ma'am and making sure to thank her for her service to the community. They left generous tips, not out of showing off, but because they understood the value of taking care of those who took care of them. Mary had turned one wall of the diner into a wall of service, where photographs of local veterans, including John's famous Iwo Jima picture, hung alongside more recent images of Bear and his men from their tours in Vietnam and beyond. The wall became a point of pride for the community, with new photos being added regularly. On special occasions, like Veterans Day or Memorial Day, the diner became the center of community gatherings. The Veterans Guard riders organized motorcycle processions to the local cemetery, with John riding in a specially modified sidecar that Bear had personally designed for him. One morning, as John sipped his coffee, he reflected on how much had changed. Mrs. Chen was chatting comfortably with two bikers about her grandson's recent enlistment in the Marines. Mr. Rodriguez was showing Bear's group photos of his son's unit in Afghanistan. The diner hummed with the sound of conversation, laughter, and the occasional roar of a motorcycle, no longer a sound of intimidation, but of arrival and welcome. "You know, Sergeant," Bear said, joining John at his booth with a fresh pot of coffee, "what happened that day last year, it saved more than just the diner. It saved us. Gave us back our purpose." John smiled, watching as several riders helped an elderly veteran from his car. "Sometimes the greatest battles we fight aren't against enemies," he replied. "They're against losing our way, forgetting who we are." The diner had become more than just a breakfast spot. It was a place where old warriors could find peace, where young soldiers could seek guidance, and where the community could come together to honor service and sacrifice. The transformation that began with one veteran's courage had created a new kind of brotherhood, one that bridged generations, services, and experiences. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the medals and patches that now proudly decorated the diner's walls, John Harrison knew he had won more than just a confrontation with some bikers. He had helped create a legacy that would continue long after he was gone, a place where respect, honor, and true brotherhood would always have a home. "You know what, Bear?" John said, raising his coffee cup in a small salute. "Some battles are worth fighting not because of the enemy we face, but because of the family we create." Bear nodded, understanding perfectly. The Veterans Guard riders had found their true mission, not in intimidation or fear, but in protecting the values that every service member, past and present, had sworn to uphold. And it all started with a 93-year-old Marine who had the courage to stand his ground one more time.